Okay, thank you very much. And I've tried to make this as a micro case study. So I'm hoping that we have plenty of time. We should have plenty of time in 10 minutes. So authenticity for building community. Let me say first a word about who I am. I am a lecturer in learning and teaching in the Learning and Teaching Enhancement Unit at Aberystwyth University. So I lead our PG Cert in teaching and higher education. Before I moved to the UK in 2005, though, I taught Chinese in the US, and before that, I taught English in China. So I have quite a bit of this kind of, I could really relate to some of our earlier talks. So, what I'm going to talk about here is a case study about what I do with PG Cert. So next slide. So what is authenticity? I always like to give some definitions as a shared starting point. So if you could just click. So Schwartz says that it's bringing our humanity to work while retaining role clarity. So as teachers, that means that we are not trying to be, exactly the same as our students. We have our role as teachers, but we're bringing our full, well-rounded human being to work. Next. So Cranton and Carusetta emphasize being genuine, showing that consistency between your values and actions. I think that's really important. Sometimes that's called being a congruent educator. And encouraging in such a way that relating to others in such a way that you encourage their authenticity. And I think we heard things about this earlier today, where we make ourselves vulnerable. It gives students permission to be vulnerable. That's a big part of what, that chimed a lot with what I do here. And then living a critical life. So then the next one by Bruyckere and Kirschner, they identify 4 dimensions, 4 essential components for teaching authenticity. So one is expertise, one is passion, and I think we've heard a lot about passion, and I'm definitely in support of that, letting our students see our real passion for what we're doing. Unicity, by which they mean that the teacher, the person in the teaching role, is not just working procedurally, following a script, following a set of steps, but they're responding to what the students are doing. So you're not confined by the curriculum, but you're able to adapt. And then where they say distance, they're talking about something similar to that role clarity. So it's the appropriate distance, not so close we're trying to be their best friends, because that's might be fake, and not so distant that we're unapproachable, but finding the right balance there. So click. And so when I was reading this, all of this chimed very much with the idea of adaptive expertise as described in Bransford, and that also builds on Hatano and Inagake, where they're talking about the ability to respond, improvise, adapt to what's happening in the moment, and that they're kind of adaptive expertise, like being in a virtuoso. So you are improvising, you're not just performing sort of robotically. And Hatano and Inagake bring forward the difference between procedural and conceptual expertise. So the virtuoso, the adaptive expertise, is a person who isn't just following the rules, they are understanding the concepts and responding from there. So those are my definitions, but I tend to start with, there's a load of really great stuff out there. Next. So why be authentic? Why as teachers should we be authentic with our students? It gives our students permission to be real themselves. And so as a staff developer, in a sense, as a academic developer, my students are teachers. So I also want to model behaviors for them that they can then adapt and use in their own teaching practice as well. So if I'm real with them, then they can be real with me, and we can develop that relational closeness and those supportive bonds. And I think that's really important for reducing the anxiety. And let's be honest, we are all experiencing a very stressful period and have been for some time now in higher education and in the world, aren't we? So if we acknowledge that, then it's like, okay, we can relax. You have that physical sense, that embodied sense of relaxing. Okay, I don't have to try to be something I'm not. I can be who I really am. And so what this ends up doing is it builds that inclusive learning community. And my aim is so that no matter who they are, what their prior experience is, that they can flourish, they can find something useful for themselves in their own teaching practice and do the same thing with their own students. Next. So what do I do to be authentic in the PG Cert? Well, the first thing I do is I spell it out right from the beginning. Actually, I didn't put this onto the slide, but we have sort of a needs analysis conversation before the modules even begin. And we work out we develop a learning contract, one-to-one, me and a participant. We say, what do you already know? What do you need to know? What's your teaching context? And we work that out. Then we have a shared induction. So if you click the next, that's a slide from, I have two core ideas in the PG Cert. This is the second one, is strength and diversity. The first one is growth. So this is what I share to them, to everybody. Everyone has something valuable to contribute, no matter which person in the circle that looks like you, or, if it doesn't exactly look like you, then we'll add one. We're all part of this community together, and we all have something valuable to contribute to the discussion. So it's very much that collective improvisation, if you will. Next. So here are some of the other things that I do. I don't try to be what somebody thinks a teacher's supposed to be. I'm just me, and I do have that passion. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have that passion. So I will share that with my students. I will let that be visible. And my experience in those different contexts of teaching or observing other people teaching, bring that all into play. And that gives them the permission to share that about themselves and hopefully light that spark. I share small things from my daily life, something's not about learning and teaching, and invite them to share. So I'll talk about an example there that just builds that dynamic. I think also being open about the frustrations we all face, so that addresses that vulnerability, or it's like, there's some things that are being sometimes imposed on us we don't like, and I'm not going to pretend that that's not happening. So I'm happy for you to click through until you get all of these. These are some of the phrases that I use with my participants all throughout the module as I'm talking with them or running a session with them. I'll be honest with you. You know what? That works towards building that trust. I'm not going to gloss over something. That acknowledging their prior knowledge, they're all different. We're all different. Everyone has something valuable to say. And also, there's no one right way to teach. So find what fits your context, so they don't have to feel like, oh, I don't take that idea on board, or, active learning sounds a bit weird to me. Okay. I'm hoping to enable them to use active learning, but I'm not saying everybody has to teach a particular way. I want to empower them to find their own way, and that should allow that relaxation. Also acknowledging that no one is perfect. I'm not perfect. They're not perfect. Their students aren't perfect, and that's okay. So we don't expect perfection, and it's all intended to be empowering. And that also links up to, we don't hold anybody responsible for things they can't control. Sometimes there are things we can't control. We know there are things they can't control, so we just do the best that we can to support them. And hopefully, and what I feel, and talk about embodied practice, I feel it physically, that there's a kind of relaxation. It's like, oh, it's okay. I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not. I can be my real self, and a three-dimensional self. Great. Next slide, please. So some of the ways that we do this are through informal sharing in different ways. And especially with the pandemic, once we moved to online teaching, our program has remained in online teaching because we've got people from all over. Eventually, we would love to be back all together in a classroom, but I'm just worried about being a vector for infection. In the current rising COVID cases, we knew this was going to happen. So I'm doing a lot of teaching by teams, so I allow time to check in. I start a little bit early. I'll stick around a little bit after. How are you doing? What have you been up to this week? How's your teaching going? And sometimes they share something that is really important. Or we might just say, you know what, I went for a wonderful walk on the weekend. I organized informal catch-up sessions where I meet with them online and I use that adaptive expertise. There's no script, there's no agenda or anything. I used to have office hours when I was physically in my office. This is instead of that, but it's regular drop-in sessions, and they can talk about whatever they want. And sometimes it's about their assessment, their assignments. Sometimes it's about a teaching challenge. Sometimes it's just about their life. Talk about our pets. I created a Padlet where we could share pictures of our pets, or some people put children. I don't have pets, but I have my children. And it's optional, it's voluntary, but you get a big smile when you look at those and you see so many people sharing this. And then we have this thing in common. We have this informal bond. And that really helps to create that positive, safe space for people to do the learning and to make themselves vulnerable while learning. Next slide. So this is actually my last slide. I don't know if I've rushed through. I didn't try to rush through. So this is the seafront in Aberystwyth. So I've been teaching remotely for almost 3 years now, and I do go for a walk on the seafront when I get a moment. And surprise, surprise, that bonding and that building trust, when I see my participants run into them on the seafront, we're old friends already. It might be the first time that we've even seen each other. And that bond has been created so that we have a really comfortable, friendly conversation right off the bat. It's not like, oh, are you so-and-so? It's like, I know you're so-and-so, and I'm me, and I know what you've been up to last week, and let's have a chat and how wonderful it is. Sorry, that's my passion coming through there. But I find that these are really small changes that you can make in your practice, but they have a really big payoff in terms of building that community of practice. And I think acknowledging that adaptive expertise that we might have and fostering it in our students. Anyway, that's what I hope so. I don't know how many minutes I took. When I practiced, it was 10.
It's fine. You're 1 minute over, so
perfect.
Oh, well done. Well done. Lots of hearts and lots of applause. Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. So shall we start from the concept of perfectionism? I think it came up a couple of times in the chat, and I think we all want to know more, or to say sort of what we think about how perhaps perfectionism is sort of doesn't allow the sort of the development of expertise, or how is kind of not necessarily enabling the things that we do. So would you like to expand a little bit on that?
Yes, I think that's exactly the point I was trying to bring across, and we've seen similar things already put in the chat and in earlier talks as well. So no matter how much of an expert you are always learning, you're always challenging your assumptions, you're examining those tacit assumptions and making them explicit and saying, is that right? Do I really believe that? Does that fit this situation? So that means that there's no perfect thing. But I think I think sometimes as lecturers, we feel a pressure to be perfect. We're presenting the product rather than the process to our students when we teach them. But actually, it's always a process. So if we are open and honest about not being perfect, then our students don't feel the pressure that they're in their assessment or their contribution to discussion, they have to be perfect. So it opens it up to make it more about growth and learning in an ongoing sort of collaborative process rather than, I'm measuring myself. We had that talk earlier about metrics, and I think students can feel they're being measured against metrics, but that's not my message.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sometimes comes exactly from, for example, staff who are very high achieving or are kind of operating in cultures where achievement, excellence, having the next, performing to the next goal is the actual goal. So I think that I would agree with you that, again, this sort of breaking this concept of perfectionism into sort of the expertise continuum is much more useful useful for our practices. There is one other, there's quite a lot on perfectionism is coming into the chat, so you might want to read that after. I want to pick on a couple of things. So the first one is, again, something that, like Richard, I love the example of, and that's your seafront sort of walk. And obviously Richard mentions authentic spaces, and again, I, like you, over COVID, so found myself sort of walking in a historical cemetery, and everybody sort of looking at me a little bit weird, like, say, why are you walking in a cemetery? But I love it, and I think that is my authentic space. So I wondered whether you wanted to comment a little bit more on that sort of authentic spaces.
Oh, I think that's a really good comment, and I think a good question. And I think that your comment about finding the cemetery as being your authentic space is really interesting, because people can have all kinds of assumptions about that, but those assumptions don't have to apply. You know, I know somebody did her PhD about inscriptions on gravestones, so she spent a lot of time in cemeteries. I think that if we allow ourselves to be real to ourselves as well as to our students, we find a place that makes us feel comfortable, is sort of congruent with who we feel we are, the places where we get rejuvenated, and if we can share, and for me, that's the seafront, and I love Aberystwyth. So I think if we can share that in a real way with our students, maybe they have a different space, but then they can talk about their space, and that can be one of the shared experiences, or we can bring something from our authentic space into the teaching space, even if that's in a classroom.
Thank you very much. One last thing, again, I think we've got 3 minutes, but Faye is already on the screen, so I think I can use them for more comments and questions. So you mentioned frustrations at the beginning of at some point in your talk, and I wonder whether you could spend a few words about how frustrations.
I could spend a few hours on frustrations.
Yeah, because I think we are all kind of having our own frustrations, but also have to teach in environments where frustration is really high and really sort of the order of the day. So, and I wonder whether that is kind of something that can help us sometimes sort of develop our expertise, or what do you think? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely a very good question. I think it does two things: acknowledging the frustrations to our students. It's like, we sort of like, it's not, don't look at the man behind the curtain, but we're going to pull the curtain back and you're going to see what people really have to do to cope with what they're facing. And we all share this experience in our own ways. And that opens up the channel for our students to talk to them about their own frustrations. And I think it goes quite far towards building trust, because we're not necessarily adhering to an official line that maybe we don't really fully buy into. We recognize the flaws and the limitations and the context that we're teaching in. So I don't know. I think it goes towards building trust. And I did have an experience where my inbox is overflowing, and I meant to respond to a student's query straight away, but then so many more messages came on top of it, and then they sent me a chase-up message, and I said, oh my gosh, I'm really sorry. I meant to respond to that, but thank you for reminding me, and then that gives a positive feeling on it. I'm really sorry, but it's real. And then the student said, don't worry about it, it's all fine, and then we're all good. And I think that's where we want to be. And that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. So we need to wrap up here. Okay. Thank you for your questions. And again, round of applause. Thank you very much. And